Unfortunately for him, he was unaware of his rich and entangled cultural heritage. As he explained, he knew virtually nothing about my ancestors. What he did know about them was their slave background and virtually none of their cultural attributes. What he knew of his culture came through the deep piety of his mother. This is what he wrote. My mother was very religious. Every night she called the children together for evening prayer before going to bed. She always led in prayer. There was no doubt in my mother's mind that God answered prayers. She believed this to her dying day. When I made a trip around the world in the latter part of 1936, the early months of 1937, my mother knew that it was her prayers that brought me safe home. Shouting in church was common in my youth, and Mother did her share. The preaching was usually otherworldly, and the minister often stirred up and exploited the emotions of the people. This fact, along with her somewhat turbulent home life, accounted for Mother's outbursts in church. The depth and sincerity of her religious faith had great influence on me. Ironically, Mays never saw the linkages between the ecstatic religious behavior of his mother and her African cultural heritage. Living under the brutality of the hardening of racial segregations, Mays looked toward formal education as a weapon to fight against American white supremacy. For Mays, his mother's tradition emphasized an otherworldly Christianity which was highly moralistic and led by a clergy with little, if any, formal educational training. He looked upon the Afro-Baptist tradition that formed him from a social scientific perspective as a survival mechanism that helped black people to endure the social evils that prevailed in his youth. In addition, in the South of his childhood and young adult life, Mays saw that central to Southern racism was biblical fundamentalism that undergirded it. Yet the impact of his mother's tradition never departed him. His Christian faith, which he inherited from his mother's deep faith, was his shield and his sword as he endured to attain a formal education and to combat racism. Throughout his writings in his two major books, The Negro's God and The Negro's Church, he searched both the slave past as sources to his understanding of what he would call a prophetic Christianity. The Afro-Baptist tradition, having grown up in this milieu, Mays felt a call to ministry and also a passion for earning a formal education. He struggled to reconcile his desire for education and his calling. Mays' determination to act on his vocational call led him through what I call an abolitionist network of Baptist institutions from Epworth, South Carolina, just outside of the town of 96, South Carolina, to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. Now, I've been to Lewiston, Maine, and there's only one thing in Lewiston, Maine. There's Bates College. And the only other thing that ever happened in Lewiston, Maine, this is a trivia question for the audience. Does anybody know what happened in Lewiston, Maine in 1965? There's only one other great event happened in Lewiston, Maine in 1965, and that was the second Muhammad Ali Sonny Liston fight took place in Lewiston, Maine. Those are the only two things that are Bates College and the second fight for Muhammad Ali. And just another trivia point, a young student was at Bates College then named Bryant Gumbel, and this is where he began his life to become a sportscaster. And one last thing about Lewiston was that an older gentleman in the bed and breakfast that I stayed when I was there said he had never seen so many blonde-haired black women except from the time that the fight came. And all of these people came from New York City, of course. But Mays used that network, a network that began at Virginia Union University in Richmond, Virginia, and then Bates College. It was the first time he encountered a learned white Baptist clergy and the contemporary biblical scholarship of his day. He became particularly enamored with the social gospel as expressed in the writings of a German-American named Walter Rauschenbusch. Central to Mays' ministerial calling was a desire to gain a thorough knowledge of the Bible and other intellectual resources, and in order to combat Jim Crow and its religious utterances and social practices. In 1982, Mays explained to an interviewer that his motivation for going to Bates College and then going on to the University of Chicago was about the Bible. I went to the University of Chicago not because I was going to learn how to preach. He had already heard great preachers in South Carolina and Virginia. I went to the University of Chicago because I liked their philosophy, that if you can interpret anything in the Bible, you need to know the political, social, and economic conditions of when and how it was written. That made sense to me, even coming from an Orthodox faith. I set out, at Chicago to learn how each of the 66 books of the Bible were produced. To use the words of the religious historian William Hutcheson, Mays had a modernist impulse. His theological modernism was developed at Bates College and further along as a student at the University of Chicago under a man named Shirley Jackson Case, Henry Wyman, and Edwin Aubrey. Although Mays studied under Case and Wyman, he continued to seek and meld the best of the Afro-Baptist traditions with the critical inquiry he found in the modernist biblical studies and theology. In his writings, particularly The Education of the Negro Minister in 1933, The Negro Church in 1933, and The Negro's God, he gives voice to the tradition that developed from his encounter with modernist theology. It was during his years as the dean of Howard University School of Religion that he organized a plan to accredit the school, to recruit students, and to educate them in modernist theology and give them a vision of the social gospel. His work with the Reverend Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University, and a leading proponent of nonviolence and the techniques of Gandhi, propelled Mays to want to build Howard School of Religion as a place for an insurgent professional black clergy. In 1940, when Mays was selected to be president of Morehouse College, he took his vision for the Negro clergy and reshaped it to be a philosophy supporting the education of Morehouse students. His modernist theological leanings, however, were a bit of a minor controversy. Just after Mays was appointed to be the president of Morehouse College, the Reverend D.D. Crawford, a Morehouse College alumnus, charged in the May 15, 1940 issue of the Georgia Baptist magazine that his alma mater had made a grave mistake hiring Mays as president. Benjamin Mays, he wrote, is a notorious modernist. He believes in everything in general and nothing in particular. He's a scientific Christian, not a religious one. He contended, that Crawford contended, that Morehouse from its inception had been a college led by thorough Orthodox Christian leaders until the appointment of Mays. He alleged that with Mays' appointment that the Board of Trustees would wipe out every vestige of what Negro Baptists hold dear. The board's agenda in selecting Mays was to impose a radical education that leaves out God and Baptists. The board's education would enforce upon us, Crawford said, what they call a liberal religion. In spite of his complaints, Mays' position as president of Morehouse College was never in doubt. And although Crawford's charges were ignored, he was correct in arguing that Mays was not a traditional Negro Baptist.